Hi, I am Dr. Kim Sage. Welcome to my YouTube channel and to this week's series on parentification. We're going to take a super deep dive into this experience for so many children who were raised by parents who really struggled with some form of their own ability to parent for many different reasons we're going to go into. We're going to talk about the trauma, the complex trauma, some examples, some signs where you struggle, and at the end of this we'll wrap up some things you can do to work on healing yourself if this is part of your story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and checking the little box, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. Also, as a reminder, I have 3 courses down below. You'll find the links. But just as a quick example, I have a course on remothering yourself, which ties very nicely into this topic and definitely happens for so many of us who have a wounded inner child because that child wasn't able to bloom and develop as a child for lots of different reasons. And my flagship course called Healing and Dealing with Borderline and/or Narcissistic Parents. It's a 75 lesson course with a workbook, this workbook with everything you can imagine in here in terms of understanding your childhood and your trauma and what to do now, meditations, affirmations, and videos and journal exercises. It's really chock full of information that comes not just from my own experience as a clinician, but from the research and from my own experience as a human being and who had parents who really struggled. So please check those out. Those are the PDF files that I had bound. In the course, you just get the full PDF file. You can kind of just leave it there if you want. You can, have it printed, whatever works best for you. Okay, so let's get into today's topic on parentification. What I want you to understand at the core is that, as with everything, there are some upsides that sometimes, yes, they make us more resilient, they make us more independent, and none of those things are bad. It's just that they often come at a cost, and we often tend to lean into those strategies of hypervigilance, of isolation, of lack of trust, of not setting or holding boundaries, because we didn't learn how to do that. And so that is why I'm so passionate about making these videos, is to help you really unpack what you want to keep and what you'd like to say maybe work on and modify, change, or improve. So when it comes to parentification, there are some upsides. Like I'm saying, we tend to be called, look how mature you are for your age. Oh, you're an old soul, aren't you? Look at how responsible you are. You just take care of everything. You can play alone, whatever it is. And so that sounds great, and the world rewards that. But remember, thinking about going back to attachment sometimes, it's really a survival tactic. It's not necessarily a natural part of your development. So the issue with parentification is that it really is an invisible violation of boundaries, an invisible trauma that we often don't even recognize till years later because it just was that way. Unless something happened like you lost a parent and then you became in the parenting role. There can be these identifiable points, but the larger dynamic is that it's this invisible ongoing wound that you live. And the violation of the boundary can really be functionally in terms of, I'll get into this more later this week, but in terms of, like, let's say how you were expected to run the household or raise a sibling, or it can also be emotional in terms of parentification, where you are emotionally caretaking adults or others in your home, but you're still a child. And so many kids get pushed into this role for lots of reasons. Emotionally immature parents, parents with mental health struggles, let's say an untreated borderline parent might inadvertently turn to the child as a companion, not to be abandoned, as an adult partner, and kind of use them to give them a sense of not being rejected. And so they might overshare their adult problems, and they might you might have parents who pulled kids into arguments. I've seen many cases where the child was pulled into the actual argument between the parents, whether they were divorced or married, and sit down. The child would sit down as a mediator or tell one parent to behave. It could be a parent who has a substance abuse issue, a chronic health issue. It could be anything. And so oftentimes the kids get pulled into this, but what happens is, in the service of taking care, and being a caretaker is a huge sign of this issue, is you often lose yourself in the process. And so what's really happening is also often called role reversal. The roles get flipped. And in many ways, you're the little adult. Now, it might seem like on the outside that the parent is in charge and an adult, but when it really comes down to it, what's happening is kind of going back to that anxious attachment dynamic. You are overly involved in the parent's state of mind, and you might be overly involved in their life, in the way the home is run, and all of those things. And so one of the ways you really might recognize that this may have been you is if something happened like I described, and or you really identify as a caretaker, and you kind of always were. Now, I think each of us have a, more or less nurturing nature, some more than others, right? But the heart of it is that you learned very early that the way to get your needs met was by rotating around others. Now, there's in a research article here, I want to read you the definition. It says, parentification is a disturbance in the generational boundaries. Generational meaning the hierarchy, or continual from other generations. We're going to talk about trauma that continues later in the week. Such that evidence indicates a functional, that's where you're like taking care of the household, too many chores, things like that, and or an emotional role reversal in which the child sacrifices his or her own needs for attention, comfort, and guidance in order to accommodate and care for the logistical and emotional needs of a parent and or sibling. And so, like I said, some of the examples will be really, as we'll go into this week, about how those different dynamics play out. And so the first thing I would encourage you to do today is to just ask yourself, first of all, what was my role in my family system? Did I find myself over involved in my parents' conversations? Did I tend to take care of my siblings so much so that I made all their meals and make sure they did their homework and I drove them to school? And maybe that was something you had to do to survive. Maybe your parent worked the night shift, or you were barely getting by and you were the oldest child, and so that was just what it took. This isn't about necessarily making parents feel bad who just had to survive. It's just that when you are repeatedly having a child engage in an adult role, I'm not talking about sometimes driving kids to school for you, or sometimes helping out, or contributing in some ways, like with chores and things like that. This is a role where you will know what I'm talking about, where again and again and again, you felt like you were the adult. And we're going to go through in tomorrow's video the often common signs, but I will just say, just to kind of throw out there, like I said in the beginning, things like hypervigilance, having boundary issues, being very self-reliant and independent, and yet also wanting to be cared for, but that not feeling safe, like a fear of engulfment. Definitely always scanning for a person's mind and mood shifts, as in I talked about all those videos in hypervigilance. Not liking to be too vulnerable and protecting that. And often really going back to the core, a deep self-blame, a shame and a guilt inside that can really set the stage for this type of experience in childhood, creating complex trauma and chronic ongoing relationship issues as a result, because you are still operating in that role, and then you take that into adult relationships where you don't let people in, or you're constantly chronically hypervigilant, right? At the core, you choose people that will never really challenge you to be vulnerable. So that's how it plays out in relationships, and we will talk so much more about that. So the first thing is to think about what you think your role is, and then maybe to reflect upon, I wonder where that began. What would be the origin point? Maybe something happened, like I said, or maybe you'll say, it was just always that way. I always felt like I had to rotate around my parent and take care of them. Or I just, even as a kindergartner, found myself in the middle of arguments with my family. Don't know why, I always did that. So those are common. And the last thing I'll say that's very common is that when you have this style, you're often told things like I said, like, you're such an old soul. The other big one is, why are you so serious all the time? Like a parent will say to a child, you need to lighten up. Like, God, what is wrong with you? I got this, I'm the parent. It's like, no, you didn't. And I had to be serious because I wasn't allowed to be the child. And that is going to be the core of the work, is going back to healing that inner child that you were so often blocked from kind of blossoming into as a result. So that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for being here. Please feel free to share your thoughts and feelings if you feel safe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.